Welcome to today's panel on the UNA-UK, Opportunities and Priorities for the Organisation in a Fragmenting Order. I'm Jane Kinninmont from the United Nations Association UK, an 80-year-old, soon to be 81, like the UN, charity dedicated to advancing the principles of the UN Charter. And right now, that really includes convening conversations about how the UN will need to adapt, evolve and reform in the future. There are a lot of discussions about UN reform. Often they are the same discussions that have been going on for 20 or 30 years. And for this panel, we wanted to broaden out beyond talking about structural and bureaucratic reform, but rather to bring in some expertise on the UN itself and some expertise on the global challenges that international cooperation needs to address, so that we will be looking at the purpose and the function of multilateralism in the future, and then thinking backwards about what the UN may need to look like to address those issues. And I'm delighted, first of all, to be introducing Dali Tenho. Dali is one of our trustees at UNA-UK. He has spent a long time working inside the UN system, particularly on political and peacekeeping affairs. He has worked as a researcher for Ban Ki-moon, and also played a leading role in the London International Model United Nations, helping to build the talent pipeline for the multilateral system. So, Dali, as a practitioner, I'd love to hear from you, first of all, about how you see the UN at this juncture. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Happy to be here. I'll say I'm in this strange position at the moment where I'm outside of the UN. My job was cut at the beginning of the year, so I am a bit freer in what I can say. But I will be returning relatively soon, so I'm going to have to be ever so slightly careful about what I say in public with the camera pointing at my face. Look, at first I would say, surprise, surprise, the state of the UN is bad. It is very discouraging, and I think that even collectively, the people who care about the UN, we're not even really being honest with ourselves in the public conversation about how bad it is, because I think it's even worse than we tend to acknowledge and realize. To me, unfortunately, the UN at the moment, it feels like it's in hospice on its deathbed. It is very discouraging to see this. I think we're not always acknowledging this because we care about the system, and so we're always looking for positive things to point at, like the fact that there's still the blue helmets that are doing things out in the field. But I stress this because I do think that for us to have a serious conversation about the future of the UN, how we can improve it, we need to be cognizant of just how bad the situation is at the moment. Other thing why I think that sometimes we are not totally collectively aware of how discouraging it is that it still looks from the outside in a way that the things are still there. There still is a Secretary General. There still are meetings happening in the General Assembly. There are still peacekeeping troops out in the field. So we're seeing things that are familiar from the heyday of Kofi Annan. But the reality is that the architecture is there, the building is still in New York, the meetings are still taking place, but in a way the soul of the UN has dissipated. Because the UN it is the architecture, but more than that, it is the embodiment of humanity's, what am I trying to say? Our collective acknowledgement that even though we have lots of differences, we do have shared interests, and we do want to work together towards those shared interests. Now, with the geopolitical divisions, but also with divisions within countries, it's much harder for us to come together and recognize those shared interests and work towards them. So in a way, I also kind of think of the UN at the moment as something kind of like the transition between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, where it took a long time for people to realize that the Republic was gone and that it was now the Empire. Different direction, because the Empire was a consolidation, whereas with the UN, it's more of a dissipation. But I do think that, let's think forward with the benefit of hindsight to look back in a moment. Anyway, so what I would say is we have lived in a bit of a bubble since the end of the Cold War, I would put it at around 1988. That was the start of, Polar rivalry is over, the system is now functioning, massive jump up in peacekeeping operations. The Gulf War was authorized by the Security Council. And we've had this growth in the United Nations system, which I think peaked at around 2015. I would put it at 2015 because that's the year when we had the Paris Agreement. It's the year that we had the SDGs. It's the moment where we still have these big collective ambitions. It was also the year where Obama hosted a leaders forum on peacekeeping at the UN. We haven't seen an event like that since. And then from after 2015, it's kind of dissipated. So we still have the Pact of the Future, which is very encouraging. But on the whole, I think across metrics, 2015 was also the year we had the most peacekeeping troops. So since 2015, we've kind of gone down. So in this kind of bubble period, we have also created a sprawling architecture that is much larger than what we've had during the Cold War. And now, in a way, it's like the international community kind of woke up from a hangover and thinks, okay, I don't know, I bought too many shoes and I need to return them. So now it's looking at how can we sort of deconstruct it in the way that the US says, it's getting back to basics. That's not entirely wrong. I mean, we do have, the Secretary General makes this point in his UNA-UK initiative. We've got 140 entities in the UN. We've got 240 different intergovernmental bodies, many of them duplicative. In 2024, the UN supported, I think it was 27,000 the Secretariat only, 27,000 intergovernmental meetings. There's too many mandates, too many resolutions. It's unwieldy, so we need to lower this a little bit. I feel like I'm going off from your question, Jane.
No, it's
still, yeah? Okay.
So where would you take it?
Where would I take it? Yeah. Part of, I think, this dissipation that we've seen in recent years is Guterres, who kind of came into office with this far-sighted vision of what to do with global governance. Very intelligent man with a really wonderful thinking behind how the UN can support on a wide range of fronts. I think his Our Common Agenda, I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, is really a wonderful instrument of collective problem solving. However, the UN was created to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. In the years of Guterres's leadership at the helm, more conflicts, and frankly, at the UN, unfortunately, we seem to have sidelined ourselves from real impact in terms of conflict mediation. So where I would take it is what I would hope that the next Secretary General does is really focus on on peace and security, really be active out there, being a voice. The UN, the Secretary General doesn't have an army, doesn't have an economy, doesn't have any leverage as much as they're more a force and their legitimacy. If we are too quiet, if we sideline ourselves, if we're not seen to be out there, that diminishes us. So I would hope that the next Secretary General really kind of revives the moral authority of the office of the UN and goes out there and tries, because that's the key thing. We may not be able to exercise any impact in particular conflict situations where there's lots of interest at play, where the great powers are involved, but at least try, which unfortunately we have done less of in recent times. I think I can leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane.
Gally, that has set us up really well, and I think with a sense of the seriousness of this current moment. And I'm keen now to turn to you, Sam. You frame your work in terms of collective action to solve global problems. What role do you think the UN has to play in this world where maybe we're seeing multilateralism become more fragmented or more competitive? There's a lot of initiatives bringing together groups of like-minded countries. What does the UN still have to offer? And I know you've written a lot about the UK's role. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the UK's place in the UN right now. Doesn't seem to be the most active, but let's hear what we...
Yeah. So I came back from New York yesterday. So I've been in New York for the last 2 weeks, speaking with diplomats, which is part of a separate British Academy project looking at the kind of future of the Security Council. So my comments very much will speak to the Security Council, and I want to kind of give an insight into where the Security Council is at the moment, what are the challenges it faces, and then how can the Security Council become better in terms of its collective response to peace and security, and again, chime the previous comments as well. So I want to focus in on a particular example that will give you a sense of what's going on in the council at the moment, because I think a lot of what happens behind the scenes, let's say, we don't hear as much about. A lot of the discussion about the council we often hear is about the veto and about how the veto blocks and stops the council from working effectively. But I want to talk also about the way in which geopolitical differences and the major differences that we see in the council at the moment are having an impact in other ways that often we don't talk about. So the big discussion at the council at the moment is the one, might not seem that exciting, but basically the fact that we haven't been able to agree to chairs of subsidiary bodies. So what are the subsidiary bodies? You might think, well, why does this matter? Essentially what the subsidiary bodies of the Security Council do is they are basically most often elected members. They're the ones in charge of the sanction committees. So the sanction committees do vital work. If you think of the UN Security Council's role, sanctions is a very important tool the Security Council can do in terms of supporting peace and security. At this stage, we have yet to agree on who will be the chairs of those sanction committees. And this has been going on for months. So basically what's happened is this is supposed to be agreed in October. So when you're a new elected member, when you come on the council, you can sit there and start the work that's required. But it's being held up. And this is a pattern that we saw last year as well. And it's part of what you might see as an increasing trend in the Security Council. That the basic things that should function, it's kind of everyday functioning, are being blocked and stopped. And so the big issue that's blocking at the moment is Iran. So essentially, Russia, China refuse to accept the Iran Sanctions Committee. Because everything has to be done by consensus, if you don't have consensus, then none of the work can be done. So all the work happening around sanctions around Haiti, Sudan, etc., that work essentially has to be done by whoever is the president of the council for that month. And so that's on an ad hoc basis. In the normal way, how the council should work is that there should be someone, a state who's agreed to be the representative on that particular sanctions committee. And I think this gets to the heart of a big problem the Security Council is having. It's not just that we're seeing states vetoing initiatives, etc., but just the day-to-day functioning of the council is failing. And the sanctions committee, I think, is an example of that. And what the crazy thing is going forward, so today we'll find out who will be the new members of the elected members of the council. And what should happen then is basically they should begin a process of deciding who will be the chairs of those subsidiary bodies next year. We haven't even decided who are the chairs of those bodies this year. So you can see how this creates this huge backlog of work. And this is blunting a key instrument of the Security Council. Its ability to have those sanctions committees, to draw on panels of experts, all that work is being impacted. And for me, that gets right at the heart of why the council isn't working. It's not just the veto initiative, it's so much of the other work that it does. And that's something that came up a lot in the interviews when I was speaking with diplomats about frustration with how ineffective the council is at the moment. And so if I think about this question of what can we do, how can we improve and change the situation, there is a lot of talk that this phrase back to basics has certainly been used. You hear diplomats talk about this a lot. How do we bring the council back to basics, allow it to focus on peace and security issues? And I think one of the challenges here is the term back to basics means something very different depending on who you speak to. When you speak to the Americans, they have a very clear sense of what they mean by this is what back to basics of the Security Council is. I think for other states it's something slightly different. But I think one thing that most states, I think, at the moment see is a problem with the council is part of it is just, again, reflects comments from earlier, just how much kind of work there is and how backlogged the system currently is. And the need for, I guess, more effective diplomacy, ones that look like it basically means we need to get people in a room talking. You speak to diplomats, those who've been there for many years, they don't tell you that there is much less people in a room speaking than there was 10 years ago. People just don't interact in the same way in informal settings. We constantly see meeting. We had a big open debate last week when China was president of the council. We see a lot of those big open debates, but they're just prepared statements. They're just states going up, making a statement. Those aren't the kinds of tough diplomatic conversations that are often required. And so a lot of what came up in some of my discussion with diplomats is the need for more informal spaces for discussion and tough discussion, rather than this tendency to kind of repeat statements and then again fill up the program of work with lots of meetings that don't really push us any further forward. And so one of the challenges I think going forward in terms of how do we improve the Security Council, it has to become, in some regards, it has to move back to some of the ways it worked in the past in an interesting way. It has to actually involve a bit more informal backroom negotiation and discussion if there is going to be decisions ultimately made. Because we've gone through this period of having this more open discussion with this emphasis on transparency. Some of that has been good, but also it's hard to say that it's functioning that effectively in that sense. So I think one thing that we have to focus on is how do we change diplomacy? And I think here's when we need creativity. And actually, this is incredibly important for the potential new Secretary General. Creative diplomacy, ways of doing things differently, because the current system doesn't work. It's not functioning effectively. And so by that, I mean, you need individuals who are willing to work in different ways. And when you speak to diplomats, they'll often talk about particular individuals who've been on the council who are unusual in the way in which they work. They maybe had a different way of bringing people together. And the characters and the makeup of the council matter so much. The current makeup of the council is going through difficult periods, but you speak to some diplomats who say, well, the council was working effectively during this period. They had a really good permanent representative during this period. They were effective at bringing these groups together, even though there was disagreements, etc. So I think it's very much about personality. I think you can't underestimate just how significant personality is to the effectiveness of how the Security Council functions. And that's true of the broader makeup of who is on the council. That's also why the elections today matter. I mean, some of the seats are uncontested, but whether Germany gets on or Austria or Portugal will have a big impact on how the Security Council functions. The other thing to briefly say, if I've got enough time, is also the fact that the Security Council is having to accept the fact that there is a lot of multilateralism and negotiation going on outside of the Security Council. And it has to become more comfortable with the fact that we are seeing the rise of things like minilateralism, so different groups working outside the confines of the Security Council to try and address peace and security issues. And I think the new Secretary General will have to be recognised that is an ongoing practice, and it's partly a reflection of both the Council not quite representing the world as it is today and the need for other states to be involved in these negotiations, but also partly, back to my first point, the Council isn't functioning that effectively, that things are being stopped and blocked. So I think there is a need to recognise that there's a greater role for regional organisations, so that the UN has to find a way of more effectively working with regional organisations moving forward. And to kind of wrap up my general thoughts here, I think the Security Council has many tools it could use. It's not really using many of those tools effectively at all. So before you get to this point of saying, well, let's add this state to the Council, to me, it's before we even get to that conversation, we have to think about, well, how do we want it to work? What practices does it have? How can we improve diplomacy within the Council before we even think about adding more members? Because will adding more members necessarily just lead to the same problems that we currently have? So I think the emphasis has to be on how we do diplomacy, how we get more creative, and how we do things differently. And that means, as I say, I think having more difficult conversations, having diplomats who are willing to meet more informally in settings outside of the Council in which some of the hard negotiation ultimately has to happen.
Well, thank you, Sam. It's really great to be able to get your fresh takeaways straight away from New York. And, I think with the regional organisations, unfortunately, some of them are going through the same problems.
Yes.
And what you were saying about the lack of informal space reminds me of what the OSCE has been going through really dramatically, because that's an organisation designed to bring Russia and Europe together, but with many European countries refusing to talk to Russians. So they're in this weird loop where they will make statements to one another, but not have the conversation over coffee where the actual work could be done. So it's an interesting dilemma, and I like the point you made about how more transparency might have made some of that harder. So let me come to Asha Herten-Crabb, who's an assistant professor of international organisations at the University of Warwick and who works particularly on looking at the sort of processes of decolonisation and the issues of inequity and inequalities that are embedded in international organisations and global governance. And since we've heard Sam's take on the Security Council, I'd like to sort of broaden that out and think about how the rest of the world is perceiving the Security Council and how those inequalities are affecting the state of the UN. And anything else that you'd like to make of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, my comments go a little bit broader than the day-to-day functioning of the Security Council, which was very interesting to hear about. Thanks, Sam. I think it's pretty evident, especially in the last few years, that states and especially people are increasingly seeing the Permanent Five as countries with disproportionate influence over an unequal international order that they were both central in creating and from which they have most benefited. And that perception certainly shapes trust in international cooperation in pretty fundamental ways. Partly, of course, is the most obvious question of representation when we're talking specifically about the Security Council and the P5. The Security Council still reflects the geopolitical settlement of 1945. Britain and France inexplicably retained permanent seats, while Africa, with 54 states and around 1.5 billion people, has none. Neither does Latin America. And so calls for security reform reflect for frustration with an institution that doesn't resemble the world it claims to govern. But I think the issue is certainly deeper than representation alone, especially since even without such things as the Permanent Five and the veto, states like the US, China, and I would include the EU, would still wield vastly more military and economic power than the rest of the world combined. And so recent actions of the P5, or perhaps the P3, silence or inaction on Israel's settler colonial genocide in Gaza, Russia's colonial invasion of Ukraine, what we're seeing now with Iran, and not so much an aberration of a smooth-running liberal international order, but a reflection of the unequal distribution of power on which that order has always rested. So I guess reflecting on Sam's remarks just briefly, we have to ask, if we are to have a functioning and smooth-running UN Security Council, for whom does it actually work? Because we know that when the UN Charter was signed, much of Africa and Asia remained under the control of Western empires. So the UN emerged speaking the language of equality and universal rights within an international system marked by extreme inequalities of wealth and power. And those histories continue to shape contemporary politics, including these debates that we see over climate change and global health, because countries and people are not entering those negotiations from equal positions. Of course, we all know some are facing rising sea levels, drought, debt crises, collapsing health systems, even in this country, to be fair, while contributing very little to the emissions or economic structures that produce those conditions, while others built wealth through centuries of industrialization and extraction and retain far greater financial capacity to respond to those challenges. So as a result, these negotiations on climate change, on vaccines, are not just technical discussions. They are arguments about responsibility and whose lives are protected and allowed to flourish within the global economy. So I think some of this debate explains why international consensus is so hard to get to, and increasingly so as the fundamental inequalities of the international system have become so evident, especially to those of us in the West who've not had to live through its worst manifestations. So states are not just disagreeing over immediate national interests, but over the history of the international order itself. Many governments in the global South continue to interpret contemporary inequality through histories of empire, extraction, and uneven development. By contrast, political elites in much of the West often detach present global inequalities from the historical processes that produce them, and I would argue continue to reproduce them under the guise of things like free trade and market opening. And this gulf matters politically because climate agreements require governments to accept costs and constraints in the present for the sake of a shared future. But collective sacrifice becomes difficult to sustain when states fundamentally disagree about who created the system, why it was created this way, and thus who should bear the burdens of addressing its consequences. And so if this is the nature of the problem, and I guess I have the benefit of sitting here and saying that's what I think part of the problem is, then the question becomes, what role should institutions like the United Nations play, or what role could they play? We know that the UN is unlikely to transform the material structures of global inequality because it has frankly failed to do so over the last 80 years. But it remains one of the few international spaces where these historical disagreements can be openly articulated and politically recognized. Historically, anti-colonial movements used the UN and the language of self-determination to challenge empire. International pressure through UN institutions also played an important role in isolating apartheid South Africa. So the organization may be limited and inconsistent, but it has still provided political visibility and legitimacy to struggles that dominant players initially resisted. And the contemporary UN, despite all of its struggles, does continue to provide some examples of this. The Permanent Forum on People of African Descent has created institutional space for discussions of racial justice, colonialism, racial injustice, and justice, colonialism and reparatory justice that were long marginal within mainstream international politics. And similarly, moments such as the UN General Assembly welcoming Ghanaian President John Mahama back in April, I believe, his calls for recognition of slavery as the gravest crime against humanity show that the organization can still legitimize debates about historical responsibility that many states would prefer to avoid. And of course, the voting record demonstrates that very little has changed with the usual Western subject, with Western states rejecting and abstaining that call by President Mahama. So these debates matter. These debates about history and justice matter because international cooperation depends partly on whether global obligations are perceived as fair and legitimate. And without some recognition of how global inequalities were produced and how they continue to shape vulnerability to climate breakdown, debt, and ill health, appeals for collective action are unlikely to generate durable consensus, much less the transformative change that is required. So I think at 80 years old or 81, maybe the UN's most important role is less about managing this international order as it currently exists or trying to return to some imagined golden age of global cooperation, and more about sustaining political space for disagreement over history, inequality, and responsibility. It can't resolve climate change or global inequality on its own, but without institutions capable of facilitating dialogue across profoundly unequal experiences of the world economy, I would say that cooperation on all of these issues will remain extremely difficult. And so there is still value in what the UN can bring to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Asha. Well, let me bring in now Kennedy Mubeva, who is with us from the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge University, which is a really fantastic institute working on all sorts of fascinating and alarming global problems. Kennedy's also involved in a working group that's contributing to the next IPCC report setting the agenda on global action on climate change. And Ken, I'd like to ask you, given the political differences that we've heard about, what is the level of ambition that the UN should have on tackling climate change? We've just seen a COP that did manage to sustain basically a consensus -1 without the US, but some countries are willing to go much faster than others. How do you see the role of the UN in tackling the climate challenge today?
Thank you very much, Jane, and it's a pleasure to be here today and to join this very distinguished panel. And my contribution here today, of course, will focus on climate change, but also draw out some of the broader lessons about multilateral cooperation. So start with a quote to preface my comments, and it's from the American inventor Charles Kettering, who said that people are very open-minded about new things, as long as they're exactly like the old ones. And the topic here today is very, very prescient comment, and I'll use that to try and focus my presentation on challenging some of the core assumptions that we, including myself, have held, but also what this moment suggests, perhaps, in terms of thinking anew about some of those ideas. I won't present them as answers as such, but kind of as motivational points and questions for further discussion. So I'll organize my remarks around 3 key points. The first one is, of course, thinking about the collective action by the UN. What is the role of the UN presently in the future in terms of collective action? What kind of institutional changes are needed to kind of make the UN fit for purpose, so to speak? And I'm sure those in the UN have heard that, and I'm sure you can kind of laugh, because especially academics who love criticizing the UN, we've kind of done a really thorough understanding of the institution. And the last point I'll make is kind of on building consensus and faster progress. Of course, climate change is one of the really difficult problems to address, not in terms of the ecological aspect, but also in terms of the political and governance aspect, in terms of cooperation. So the first question about thinking about collective action, I'd emphasize the point that the UN is a very important platform for global collective action. I think that point is very important to emphasize, even though it might seem trivial. In the climate change space, we could not have had this kind of the main frameworks in treaties on climate change without the UN. But the Framework Convention on Climate Change, Federal Protocol, but which was kind of deemed wasn't fit for purpose, so to speak, as some people argue. But more importantly, the Paris Agreement, which is the main multilateral instrument we have for coordinating action with climate change. So I think that's a very, very important point. But beyond that, in thinking about a decade after Paris, and it's 80 years of the UN, it's a decade after the adoption of Paris in 2015, we can start seeing the big challenges or some of the limitations in terms of multilateral cooperation. And in those 10 years, there's been a kind of difficulty in shifting the mindset from a negotiation kind of mindset to an implementation mindset. And many people who discuss climate cooperation at the global level are still a little bit stuck to the negotiation phase rather than kind of really emphasizing what does it take, or would it take for countries to meet their ambitions. So I think the first thing that needs to happen in the climate space is a paradigm shift to think about the climate regime more of the implementation phase. And from that point, assess the role of the United Nations. It might be more diminished in terms of implementing in the implementation phase of climate change, which is very different from facilitating negotiations, treaty negotiations especially. So I think that's a very important distinction to keep in mind. The second is also the geopolitical moment that we find ourselves in, where geopolitics is playing a bigger and bigger role than multilateralism. And then that kind of sets the context for what the UN can do. So in terms of thinking, I think there's a need for a paradigm shift, negotiation to implementation in the climate regime. So what institutional changes are needed? It's a very difficult question, but there are some heuristics in terms of thinking about the institutional changes. The first one is focusing on what do member states need to do, what support do they need to implement their climate commitments. That is for me, the overarching challenge. That kind of flips the logic from thinking about getting a multilateral solution first and then diffusing it to countries, but kind of flipping the script to ask what do countries need and what can the multilateral process offer. That's a very, very different question, as I mentioned, from again the negotiation phase. We can see that raises the question then what aspects of the UN, especially in this case the UNA-UK, are most helpful. The Conference on Parties, or the COP, is really good in terms of getting countries to agree on things, setting the agenda, etc., because we have countries holding presidencies, and they can set the agenda and priorities of what they want to accomplish. But there are some bodies that, especially newly established, that could play a bigger role in terms of the implementation. They might not get that visibility, especially during negotiations, but then they're very critical. In this case, we have the Just Transition Working Group, for example. Many people don't know about it, but it's one of the kind of arenas in the UNA-UK climate negotiations where the big questions are coming up. You can see geopolitical fault lines along countries. You can see countries are now starting to grapple with the dynamics and the politics of implementing their commitments. And I think in terms of in the climate change space, Just Transition Working Group, for example, in my view, should receive much more attention than the COP. That does not mean the COP is not important, but I think we should think of the role of the COP, maybe in terms of agenda setting, signaling where the agenda should go, but the actual work of implementation will be in bodies such as the Just Transition Working Group, and helping countries to, for example, the UNA-UK can really focus their resources there and trying to find how to strengthen that kind of institutional body to prepare countries to implement the Paris Agreement. They could get a lot of traction from that. And I think, of course, other people can always criticize the COP process, etc. It still has a role, but I think in terms of moving the dialogue, not so much. Final point about building consensus and faster progress. I think first and foremost, consensus is very important. It is where the COP comes in, even though people might be disappointed that it doesn't to breakthrough decisions year after year, but it's still important in terms of what's important. Coalition of the willing, of course, is very important. Some countries want to move faster. We saw some countries moving in Santa Marta, in Costa Rica, is it Colombia, or where was it? That's in Colombia. Trying to come up with some kind of set agenda on phasing out fossil fuels. That's very notable, and I think we'll see those kind of groups breaking out. But that raises a very important question again to my point about the mindset and distinction between negotiation and implementation. Coalition of the willing, of course, presupposes there's leadership. But leadership in this case should not just be rhetorical, because there's some countries that were really good in terms of articulating leadership in the negotiations, etc., which is important to get the treaty. But now leadership, the yardstick for leadership should be in terms of implementation. The countries that are actually making the difficult policy and political changes needed to move the dial. That is how leadership should be conceptualized rather than rhetorical. And that is the yardstick that should be used. Rhetoric is still important, but I think substantively, countries that are actually making those difficult decisions should be viewed as leaders. And that brings me to my last point about then where do we see leadership? You can see it at the core process, as you mentioned, like in the Santa Marta conference or the initiative, but also you can see it in the regions where if you look around now at the sub-global level, it's a multiplex world or multiplex order, as some people argue, where there's a multilateral system, but also regional cooperation is getting deeper and deeper. There are some inspirational examples in terms of the policies, but also institutional designs. And, for example, Biennial Africa Climate Summit, which are very different from, the Africa's engagement in negotiations. It was more kind of prioritized the politics of the policy and kind of is a regional rotation. We have the BRICS as well as a forum. And one of the interesting things in the Kazan Declaration of 2024 was framing climate change and connecting it to just development. And so we find those spaces, the G20, of course, which is now this big limbo in terms of its, presidencies, etc. But there are these kinds of spaces, OECD, that you can see in this movement. But then the question is then to come and draw examples from these different regions and try to consolidate them at the multilateral level. Very last point, then maybe, whereas the climate regime, the initial phases of the UN, and leading up to the Paris Agreement, the UN was very instrumental in fostering deep cooperation in terms of treaty negotiation. I think maybe now the logic could be flipping where we have more coordination at the multilateral level, but deep cooperation happening at the sub-global level. And we can unpack that in the Q&A session, but those are my comments.
Thank you very much, Kennedy. I'm going to turn now to Laura Rose Brown, who works on nuclear issues and speaking, as we were, of global catastrophic risk and the search for consensus. I would love to hear your takeaways from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Review Conference that's just taken place in New York, and more broadly about how you think the multilateral system is doing when it comes to tackling the nuclear threat.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jane. And I'm sorry that I might not be able to be quite so optimistic in terms of what's happening in nuclear weapons politics. So I'd say one of the most noticeable aspects of the recent review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty for me was the incredibly low level of ambition for this conference from the outset. So even early on day one of the conference, there were very real concerns that proceedings would not be able to go ahead as the US raised objections to the nomination of Iran as a vice president of the conference by the non-aligned movement. Now, fortunately, the conference was able to continue, but it's important to recognise the impact these moments have on our overarching expectation and hopes for the Non-Proliferation Treaty and what it does in governing nuclear weapons. I think there's an important politics at work when the avoidance of failure on day one is the only success that we can really speak of. And this really reverberated in the halls of the UN during my time there. The focus, of course, of this conference was to come up with a consensus outcome document which states could all agree to. Ultimately, they did not. Following 3 review cycles which have not produced consensus outcome documents, now is a good time to start thinking or continue thinking about how member states can be held to a higher standard and aim for something different to the low-hanging fruit of simply strengthening a treaty, which may or may not be fit for purpose. And this takes me to my second point, on what this kind of stalling progress does in terms of the broader normative architecture housed by the UN system. So something I think we need to be really mindful of at the moment is the silencing or contestation of previously established norms. and I think this is really concerning. I spent a good few years now researching the inclusion of gender into nuclear diplomacy, whether through calls for gender sensitivity, gender perspectives, or gender mainstreaming. What's quite striking in this current moment is how quickly language that was previously becoming established can be dropped off the menu. It's important to recognise that some states are still evoking these norms and their importance. However, more generally, concepts like gender, issues like the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons are dismissed as peripheral and not seen as the real security discussions. Yet, the humanitarian initiative fundamentally reshaped international conversations about nuclear weapons by focusing attention on what nuclear weapons actually do to people and societies and spaces. When these perspectives, whether they're gender perspectives or perspectives on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear issues, when these perspectives become politically contentious, what is being contested is often not language, but challenges to existing and entrenched power structures. And that leads me to my point on strengthening the Non-Proliferation Treaty, potentially. I think we need to be really realistic about what the Non-Proliferation Treaty is. It is not primarily a forum where we are going to see transformative change. Instead, it is a treaty that maintains a political bargain between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, and that bargain itself is shaped by long-standing inequalities in global power. But if strengthening the NPT simply means preserving existing procedures and avoiding institutional breakdown, that's not enough. Strengthening the NPT must mean ensuring that commitments remain meaningful even during periods of geopolitical tension. If norms and commitments can only survive during periods of geopolitical stability, we should be asking ourselves how robust these norms truly are. I did want to take a moment during my remarks just to more optimistically think about the role that civil society can play in terms of these issues. One misconception is that civil society is very much peripheral to the state-led processes that take place within the UN system, and I think from my own experience working on nuclear weapons issues, that just quite frankly isn't the case. Civil society is often where innovation in nuclear governance originates from, whether that is through documenting humanitarian consequences, advancing disarmament and advocacy, developing technical expertise, and importantly creating political pressure where governments have been reluctant to act. For that reason alone, civil society need a seat and, importantly, a microphone at the table. But this requires access. Many organisations face significant barriers simply getting into the room, whether for visa reasons, travel costs, accreditation requirements, language barriers. These barriers disproportionately affect organisations from the global south and communities directly affected by nuclear weapons activities. As a result, discussions about inclusion often take place in spaces that remain structurally exclusionary. So many civil society participants are familiar with the experience of being invited to contribute at the beginning of a negotiation process, but excluded from substantive discussions. At NPT meetings, civil society statements are often delivered to a partially empty room, while key negotiations in key states have left the room. And this raises a broader question. Are institutions seeking expertise and engagement, or are they primarily seeking evidence of consultation? There is room to think more creatively about this participation, thinking about earlier engagement in agenda setting, structured dialogues with affected communities, greater transparency around negotiations, and more sustained interaction between the diplomats and civil society experts. But I think to wrap up, if the UN wants kind of stronger norms and stronger taboos around nuclear weapons, it should view civil society not as an external stakeholder to be managed, but as a partner in norm creation and maintenance. For the incoming Secretary General in January 2027, this is a good starting point to reconceive of civil society's role not as an issue of participation or outreach, but instead as a governance issue on which the legitimacy and quality of UN systems rely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, and especially for underlining that role of civil society as a partner. I think in the future the UN will need all the partners it can get, but there is a problem that when an institution feels insecure, they start to become afraid of civil society. So there is something to unpack there. I'd also like to come back to something about this search for consensus when we come back to the discussion, because one of the things that seems really weird to me about this RevCon is that everyone predicted there wouldn't be a consensus final statement. But people tried to work on it, and many countries compromised on the language they wanted to try and get consensus, and then it didn't happen. And there is a question about why that remains the goal when everyone thinks that it's elusive, if not impossible. But let me invite now Tom Cargill to wrap up the panel, and then we'll bring in an opportunity for comments and questions from those in the room. Tom is the CEO of Wilton Park, so like me, a non-academic internal person in this room. But Wilton Park is an arm's length body of the Foreign Office, so it's involved in policy conversations and policy development, but through a way of working that is itself intrinsically multilateral, bringing different stakeholders from around the world to sit around the table and try to solve problems together. And Tom, I would love you to just reflect on what you've heard from the panel, and particularly think about, what recommendations might you try to draw out for the British government. It seems to me we don't have really a foreign policy strategy towards the UN just now. So I'm not going to task you with coming up with it in the next 5 minutes. But I wonder if there are things that you've heard that you think the UK should be thinking about or working on, along with anything else that might just strike you as interesting and noteworthy.
Okay, thank you, Jane. I'm going to try and make a very, very clever argument, but I'll probably better. But in reflecting on, yes, I am a non-academic, but very clever. But have been around in think tanky land, and now I occupy a very small corner of British government, not even really core British government, because we're all parts an arm's length body, so we have a degree of independence from UK government as a whole, and as such, I'm very fortunate, really, because I have the ability to speak in a slightly freer way than many of my colleagues who are in core departments. And you're right, Wilton Park, because we occupy this liminal place slightly between government and non-government. In fact, I'd argue we are one of these informal spaces where people do come together to try and have honest conversations about some of the tricky things that are often harder to talk in more formal settings. I sit on the fringe of a lot of conversations, a lot of groups from all over the world who are trying to come together around a lot of the issues that we've discussed here and others. So I have a few observations, just and it was very, very thought-provoking. What everyone was saying is I'm going to have to go away and think very hard about some of this over coming days and weeks. I mean, one thing, especially as I get older, that I get a really strong sense of is that change as we perceive it is not so much about events happening, but about trends revealing themselves. So what we're seeing now in terms of what is, I would say, a kind of emerging moment of crisis for the UN, for multilateralism, more generally, is not something that's just kind of happening. It's the revealing of a lot of interlinked things that have been happening over sometimes years, decades, sometimes hundreds of years. And we can argue whether some of the immediate causes go back to the end of the Cold War, to the founding and the inherent flaws in the UN system in its founding in 1945, and the the colonial setting in which that took place, to the financial crisis of 2008, when the scales fell from the eyes of many people around the world in terms of the fragility of European and North American power. And then, cycling through COVID and everything, all of the changes that we've seen in recent years. And through all of this, I mean, what we've heard on the panel, there's increasing cries of frustration. There's this sense that the world, as many of us believe it should be, many of us thought it had an opportunity to become, seems to be slipping through our fingers. Things are moving in the wrong direction. The world is becoming less fair. It's becoming more violent. It's becoming more divided. And that's a real... we're hearing that more and more, I feel, in the media, certainly in this country, and I'd certainly argue globally. I'd suggest that one of the reasons for that sense of increasing frustration, anger, hurt, is because actually it is power is diffusing around the world. Power is changing. The structures of power are changing. And again, we can look back to the end of the Cold War, or the financial crisis, or COVID, for being accelerants of this, but they've been accelerating something that's arguably been happening since the foundation of the UN itself. We've seen it particularly in the last couple of years with the US and the current challenges it's facing in Iran. US's ability, even desire, its appetite to show leadership, to project influence globally, that's even something being questioned by people in the administration in the US about whether it should be doing these things. Europe seems increasingly muted in many of these big global discussions. And this, I would argue, because flat power is flowing away from these parts of the world. And it's not just political power, economic power, cultural power. And this is a good thing, right? In many respects, you're starting to see, I mean, certainly my children, in a way that I was obsessed with, American culture growing up and cowboys and Wall Street and Disney. My children are really fixated on cartoons and culture coming from Southeast Asia, from Japan, from China, from Korea. They have their centre of kind of economic, cultural thought is in a completely different part of the world from where I grew up. And this is good, right? There's some more unfortunate aspects to it as well. It's not just countries outside Europe and North America that are gaining power. It's tech companies, it's individuals with a lot of money, it's other interests. So this is a complicated world in flux that we're talking about. But one of the results that we see from power, frankly, flowing from Europe and North America, is that if we're honest with ourselves, a centre of gravity, in some cases the centre of gravity for a lot of progressive movements around all sorts of different issues, climate, democracy, human rights, historically they have been very much firmly seated in Europe and North America. The money for them has been there. The kind of cultural assets have been there, the media have been there, the individuals feeling empowered and mobilised around these issues have been there. And power is also flowing away from them, I would argue, from us, you could argue. And so a lot of the frustration, I would say, around campaigners trying to campaign on things like Gaza, on climate change, on human rights and a whole range of issues, the frustration is because there's almost a sense of power and influence flowing away from those groups who are positioned in Europe and campaigning on Europe on these issues, just as much as it's flowing away from state power and economic power. So the challenge is, how do we respond to all of this? The UN, I think, is a function of what I've just described. I think there's a lot of probably sorting out that has to happen both at grassroots level around the world, and one thing that we could talk, and I'm increasingly thinking about and talking about, is how do how do you mobilize popular consent genuinely on a whole range of different issues? I feel like even in the UK, which historically over many years has been a real has a very strong tradition of popular mobilization around particular campaigning issues. Somehow over the last few decades that tradition has weakened. We've kind of lost a sense of how to achieve that. That's something I think Jane and the UNA, but there's also a whole bunch of organisations. I was talking to the trade union movement yesterday. You could argue the NGOs, Oxfam and so on are struggling with this issue of how do you mobilise at grassroots around really important global issues. But this is increasingly going to have to be a challenge for countries and societies around the world, and it's not very clear to me yet that we even have a handle on how this is going to work in large parts of the world. So that didn't really kind of help in terms of what the UK policy is. But I suppose it's a very long-winded way of saying that the UK government is going to have some influence and some handle on all this, but maybe a lot of the uncertainty and lack of leadership that we're seeing may be a function of the realisation that this is not going to be about the UK over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and other nation states, other interests are going to have to and are increasingly stepping up to contribute answers to it. The UK is no longer, and probably, it's a good thing, going to be a leader on this. But we haven't actually resolved what fills that gap, and I think that's only going to probably reveal itself over years, if maybe decades, hopefully not century.
The next 80 years. Thank you very much. And I'd like now to open it up to the people in the room. I know we have people here with expertise on peacekeeping, on the responsibility to protect, for post-colonial politics, and lots of things that I haven't heard about yet. So I would love to bring you in. Please, starting with the lady here in the back.
Christina Stefan, University of Leeds. Thank you so much, Jane, and
Nice to meet you.
UNA-UK to organise this superb and very important roundtable. Lots of questions and amazing way of summing up the trends. I will start with what Tom mentioned, what you mentioned in the lack of leadership we're currently seeing. What about leadership at the Secretary General level, the kind of visionary leadership that's needed? Going back to Delhi, how you started with the very realistic portrayal of how discouraging it really is. And you've worked with Ban Ki-moon, you've mentioned Guterres' record and so on, but just, how do we get back to peace and security focus? How important, I would really love to hear your thoughts, Tom and Dudley, how important do you think it is to see, to have a woman Secretary General as a first in 81 years to restore the relevance of the UN? I mean, is that something that maybe would work in a deeply fractured world to manage the institutional decline? That's quite obvious, and to show that the UN is really going to change. And then in terms of another trend, Sam, super exciting, 2 weeks in New York, talking to diplomats. How can we get if we can get the Security Council to work a little bit smoother? And it's something you mentioned, the challenge would be to get informal spaces for discussion, for negotiation, rather than all these statements. But you mentioned something about, how important regional coherence is, regional organizations. Kennedy gave us examples of, regional, a little bit of positive, encouraging regional efforts. And Sam, you mentioned Iran and other cases, but I was thinking about Sudan. So the 3 elected members, Somalia, DRC, Liberia, really not speaking with one voice when it comes to Sudan, right? So they have other elected members, Denmark and so on, kind of trying to what is happening. So the days of regional coherence like Libya, the Security Council agreeing
Libya 2011 because the regional members of the Security Council were speaking with one voice are long gone. Is that something that came up perhaps in your findings? Sorry, I'll keep it, but it's too long. Sorry. Thank you.
No, thank you. Great questions. And let's take the lady just in front of you.
Thank you so much. My name's Lina. I guess my current affiliation would be with Cambridge, MSc, and Oxford. My question is, I'm glad to see how many dimensions there are to increase our position of understanding of the UN's capabilities and promises, especially the incorporation of the actors who are traditionally left out of the study of the UN story, whether it be indigenous groups at Colombia's most recent COP, civil society groups, or the global south. But with the SDGs actually, and post-2015, we also see a real change in the actors who are acting via the United Nations. In particularly actors from the private sector, philanthropy, rising contractors as well, who are trying to answer the questions that the UN has traditionally been tasked with, both inside and outside of the United Nations. So my question is, what is the United Nations' role in mediating between these concurrent interlocutors in the international space? And how does the UN manage itself with work that had been the UN's perhaps traditionally, in asking questions about international development, economic sovereignty, debt, etc., but perhaps not really seeing the UN as a platform for that in other ways again.
That's a very, very live issue. I'm going to take lots of questions, I think, because we have a massive panel. So I'm going to cluster quite a few together. Georgina.
I'm just interested at the Security Council level or at nuclear politics level, do you see that there are any conversations that are being had around defensive governance in an era of rising militarization, especially around things like integrity systems and anti-corruption? Are there any kind of, is there leeway in terms of making progress on implementation of anything, right, that comes alongside those conversations? Because I'm struck by your rows as well around the importance of civil society, like something like civilian oversight of the defence sector is kind of a fundamental pillar of defence governance. So is there any kind of wiggle room that you see that's happened as a result of any conversations on defence governance?
Hello, Mira from Brighton, University of Oxford. I wanted to ask the panel to reflect a bit on what China and China's increasing power means for multilateralism. Because one way of reading China's rise in a broad sense is that it's leaned quite heavily into some aspects of multilateralism and probably been more restrained than some people might have expected militarily or otherwise. Does this mean in a future UN, China might kind of substitute for some of the roles played by other parties? If so, what would that mean about the priorities of the UN and so on? So just a broad question about the significance of China.
Joe from Center for Multilateralism Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Wondered what the panel thinks about the mandate review of the UN. What went wrong, what went right from an internal perspective rather than from the external shock perspective.
Catherine Turner, Durham University. I think it's sort of my question links quite a few of the points that have been raised. The question of power and where power lies within the system, and if we're thinking at the point of a fundamental reform of the United Nations and multilateralism, it seems that we're all talking around the peace and security function of the United Nations and perhaps the human rights as well, but I would say probably everybody in this room is interested in public good and the ways in which the system kind of regulates lives and things like that. And I'm interested in your thoughts about where the economic system fits into that. And so because we have had this, quite deliberate separation of the peace and security function from the financial institutions, and even within the multilateral system, a reluctance to do anything in human rights or peace and security that upsets business. So if you look at kind of the limitations of business human rights, of the World Bank's doing business indicators and things, all of these tend to kind of step softly in relation to business. And yet when we look at where power really is and where the harm and the threats to humanity in many cases is coming from big tech and private actors. And so if we're going to address those, then who has the power to do that? And if we're, I mean, to me it seems that states are perhaps willingly but helpless in relation to regulation, that this almost inevitability of these technologies are being developed that cause significant harm to women, to children, things like that. But states say, oh no, we've nothing, we can't do anything about that because these are private companies and they hold all of the economic power. So is there a way in which you can see that reform of the UN can take that into account in relation to not just the sort of the agreed public goods of the peace and security function, but also really tackling where real power lies and really the motivations, I mean, and the motivations of China and the United States, for example, in the peacemaking functions being, you know, kind of very thinly veiled economics. So I just wondered if people have any ideas on that.
Thank you very much. I'll take a last point from the lady here, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm Makiko Miyazaki and I'm from the University of Oxford. My question is, you know, I mean, as was mentioned, the UN tends to get a bad rep, and although some of it is warranted, do you think there's a mismatch in expectation held by the general community towards what the UN can/should do? And if so, how can we better communicate, you know, what the UN should do versus what other institutions like the civil society, like how they should step up? Do you think there's a mismatch in expectations? Yeah.
Well, thank you. Having all these questions on the table is incredibly useful for us, and it will help to inform the research that we are doing over a much longer term at UNA-UK. And if I'm hearing one recurring theme, it is a question about where power lies, and therefore who is to blame, who can change it, what should we expect? I think that is the thing that is knitting most of these different interventions together. But I'm going to ask the panelists just to pick up on one or two points that interest them or that were directly addressed to them, starting with Asha.
I feel very much put on the spot because this is something I'm extremely passionate about and don't know if I can succinctly think through thoughts for 2 minutes on the issue of economy. And I'm a political economist, so everything is political economy. And I guess the word that I put in my speech was capitalism, and the way that that is fundamentally at odds with the flourishing of all human beings and the natural world. And therefore, what could the UN possibly do when it is facilitated by capitalist states that are not, and business that are not willing to give up that power? What does it mean to reimagine the whole world economy? Because that seems to be, frankly, the only option available. Are we reforming or are we revolting? Socialists have a term of in and against the state, so I guess maybe I'll try and keep it to what we could do in with regard to the UN, and to go back to, I guess, my muted argument about the UN as a space of ideas and ideological contestation is about having, where to start? I'm from Australia. We've just gone through this truth-telling process in the state of Victoria, where 200 years of history since British settler colonialism until today has been on the table. It was only 4 years. That's not enough to cover 200 years. But it is a retelling of the history of the state. And now there is a movement to have that at the national level. That doesn't necessarily change the whole system overnight, but it puts other ideas on the table and exposes us, especially white people, especially people that have benefited from liberal democracy and liberal internationalism, to the fact that it wasn't always this way. It doesn't need to be this way. It has been violently imposed upon us to have this system that we have. And so my interest is what role the UN can play in providing space for more of those conversations. So the Permanent Forum for People on African Descent are starting to have those conversations on slavery and reparations, which slavery was constitutive of the global capitalist imperial system that we have today. And those discussions are also happening at the Commonwealth this November. Plug to pay attention to that. It's going to be all over the news. The Daily Mail's not going to like it. But I think, if nothing else, the horrors of Gaza have at least, and I'm speaking specifically as a white Westerner, have woken most of us up to the ills of this global economy that we've been able to hide from our textbooks and from our daily conversations. And so I do think with all this geopolitical rupture and the rise of voices from Africa and from the Caribbean on these particular issues, to really reckon with the foundations of our political economy opens up space to share more ideas about what else might be. Apologies for my rant.
Thank you. Laura Rose.
Yeah, okay. There's a lot of issues at stake, so I just have a couple of things. So first on this kind of the defence governance question. Conversations around defence governance, at least to my understanding, in nuclear policy making don't come up often, and it's, I think, the level of information that is required to make those mechanisms meaningful is frankly at odds with how the UK government, for example, chooses to conduct its nuclear deterrence policy, for example. So this is kind of baked into this challenge that we have in the nuclear weapons space, where there is a baked in elitism and expertise that we as mere mortals are not really supposed to know what's going on. We are supposed to just fully trust that what's going on is in our interests. I think we can really push back against that a lot more. In terms of thinking about visionary leadership, thinking about where the real power lies, I kind of just two main thoughts on this. And first, I think moving forward, we need to be increasingly cautious around what we celebrate. So at the end of this year, there will be the first review conference of the Nuclear Ban Treaty, which is an incredibly exciting moment. And for anybody that feels very depressed by the state of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, go to New York and go to the Nuclear Ban Treaty meetings. They're exciting. Civil society lead those meetings, and there is genuine innovation and desire for change and nuclear disarmament. But it's important that this treaty doesn't fall into the same kind of challenges that the Non-Proliferation Treaty sees, which is, what does it mean if we get a consensus final outcome document that quite frankly doesn't say very much, is very diluted in meaning? What purpose does that serve? So I've recently written a report that came out this week on this, which encourages us to be cautious about these celebrations at this early stage. Celebrating simply having a document written on paper doesn't necessarily get us closer to nuclear disarmament today. And then in terms of where this power lies, just very quickly, this is something that we're increasingly seeing. Somebody asked a question about the rise of China. There are these big questions of who should be pay for example, the Non-Proliferation Treaty review process. Currently, the US puts most of a large part of the bill, along with other nuclear weapon states. But the question is now, the rise of China, what we know about China's nuclear weapons arsenal, why isn't China paying more? And this was like a real sticking point of the conference in New York. So yeah, we'll leave it there.
Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, so cool. I mean, maybe I can give myself. I do think, well, maybe I kind of implied it. We are in a very dangerous moment because the old order is dying, and I do think we need to be careful what we wish for. Violent imposition by an elite, for, I would argue, for most peoples around the world is the historical norm of kind of experience, and that kind of whether we call it colonialism or just oppression is not by any means a kind of preserve of Europeans. It has been a very global phenomenon, arguably for millennia, and for better or for worse, one of the few things that came out of the horrors of the Second World War was a widespread, if still Western-centric acceptance that kind of survival of the fittest was no longer an acceptable way to organise human affairs. It'd be nice if we could further collectively agree that that is a good way of proceeding and organise the world along those lines, but with many of the problematic elements taken out. But I don't think we should assume that is the case. We've seen with the Arab Spring, with so many different case studies in history, those who hope for a kind of popular, progressive, liberal uprising that leads to a more equitable result. The number of times that has succeeded, I suggest that far fewer than the number of times that have led to some real horrors. So I think we just need to be incredibly careful about what we're letting go as much as what we want to achieve. And that just gets me onto the... a lot of these like really dynamic changes in global power structures actually are coming from within the US as much as anything else. Again, whether we think they're good or they're bad, the incredible advances in technology and AI that we are seeing, the movements towards which, I think are becoming ever closer to reality, outer space exploration. These things are as much seated in Western societies as they are outside of them, although some of the more kind of novel and interesting things may be coming from increasingly from elsewhere in the world. The role of whether the extent to which a more equitable, progressive, or sustainable set of multilateral institutions, what role China is going to play in all of those, is still something we all around the world, debate. And China and the Chinese government itself, I would say, still portrays a degree of ambiguity about the role that China really wants in terms of future global governance, particularly in terms of things like the crisis on Iran, in the situation in Ukraine, on Sudan. The suggestion so far is actually China is very cautious about becoming too involved in big global issues outside its immediate region of influence. So this could imply that depends upon your point of view whether you believe that implies that there'll be too much China involved in future international multilateral systems, or frankly not enough, and there'll be a vacuum as a result of countries like the US perhaps stepping back.
Last word.
I'll finish that.
Thanks very much, everyone, for your questions. Christine, I'll go to your question first on the African, or the A3 members of the Security Council in particular, and the issue of Sudan. I mean, to put it in, I guess, a bit more context as well, the fact that the A3, and there is now much stronger coordination between the African members of the Security Council than there has been in the past, and this is a kind of pretty significant trend of recent Security Council discussions, that the A3 work much more together as a bloc. Now, this particular combination of A3 states at the moment in the council is not working as effectively. I think that's fair to say. And the divisions between those states is actually hampering the ability to be more productive on dealing with and trying to bring to an end to the conflict in Sudan. But I think in the recent history of the UN, the last 10 or so years, one of the kind of positives you might see is kind of African member states realizing that while they might not have a permanent seat on the council, they can have a permanent voice by kind of sharing a position that kind of increases cooperation between the states. But this is only as good as the states themselves on the council, and how effective they are working together with one another. And I think that is a constant challenge moving forward. On the question about China, I want to pick up on. I mean, China's position in the Security Council is interesting. And I think, in particular, the issue of pen holding, which people may be aware of, who effectively writes the original zero draft of the resolution. China, for the first time this year, is now the pen holder on Afghanistan. It's never held a pen before. This is the first time it's holding the pen on a country situation. It represents an example of China, you might say, stepping up and saying, well, we want to hold the pen and we want to have a bit more influence in the Security Council. Because historically, the P3, the permanent members of the US, France, and the UK have dominated the pen holding process. But China has decided that, and it fought very hard to get that pen. The US was not happy about China being the pen holder for Afghanistan. From what I understand, there was a deal made behind the scenes to allow that to happen. And I think that's an interesting example of China changing its perspective in terms of, well, maybe we do need to become more involved in how power works, how power works within the Security Council, works who has the pen, who decides, who creates the resolutions. So I think that's an interesting example of China kind of stepping up on that issue. And they're just finding some running out of time here. I agree generally with the comments around, do we expect the UN to do too much? Like, if we think about all the major challenges it faces, is it relevant to think about the Security Council doing more than it's already trying to manage? Is it worthwhile introducing a whole range of new different initiatives the Council's been doing more of? I think there's some legitimate questions to ask there when it's failing to address issues in Gaza and Sudan. Conflict in the Iran situation. There's so many challenges it faces that it's unable to do. When you speak to diplomats, they say, well, we have so little time. There's even less time than ever to actually involve themselves in the tough negotiations that are required. So I think there is a bit of a need for expectation management, particularly in the Security Council. So.
Thank you very much. Dan.
I think I'll just come in on the first question about the question of the SG. Absolutely, first of all, it would be wonderful if we could have one be the next Secretary General. I think that at a time when most things at the UN seems to regress, if we can have the first female SG, it would show to some extent that the organization is still capable of renewal, still capable of some level of improvement in some domain. And that can create momentum that ideally this new SG would really build on to try to really do something. On the related question about the role of the SG on peace and security. To be an effective mediator, an SG needs to do three things. One is put out a roadmap, put out your vision for how, what is your end state for how to resolve some kind of conflict. Then be out there, make a case for it. Go to the place where this conflict is happening. Be seen to be doing shuttle diplomacy. Don't just leave it with some special envoy that nobody's ever heard of. And then the third thing is by doing this, you create momentum behind it. You also raise the cost of a country not following the roadmap that we've put out, because then they're going to have to explain to other countries why they're not going with your suggestion. A wonderful book that Tan Bin-Q wrote recently about Bhutan showed how dynamic he was with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And even though he wasn't successful, it's good that he was out there drawing attention to it. Unfortunately, again, we have not seen this under Guterres, and the next SG really needs to do this. Even when you're failing, just do it and try. I will take 30 seconds up to 1 minute to answer a question that was not asked, because I don't think we can have a genuine discussion about the value of the United Nations without addressing the question of Palestine. I don't think that on any front the United Nations has been more disappointing, and frankly I'll use the word failure, than on Palestine, which is a legacy issue that the UN has been there since the very beginning. It is incredible that the countries that supposedly are the ones to sustain the multilateral system, that claim to care about international law, that claim to care about human rights, are the ones actively aiding and abetting genocide in Gaza, apartheid in the West Bank. And so I'll take the opportunity of Tom being here to raise this for UK action. You cannot sustain the international system, you cannot sustain international law if on the one hand, Western countries are going to come to the Human Rights Council and say that countries X, Y, and Z are not treating political prisoners well or being good on LGBTQ rights, but then also arming a state that has been found to be perpetrating genocide. Stop sending weapons to Israel. Of course, this isn't very complicated. And also, UNRWA, UN Agency for Palestine. We've had 400 of our colleagues killed by member states. This is incredible, So anyway, I'm getting passionate about this also, but it's just, these are the sorts of things that we cannot be ignoring. We cannot be proud of ourselves of making progress on economic development somewhere or youth participation somewhere when we're not addressing these core issues. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And let me turn over to Kennedy for a final remark from the panel.
Absolutely. I'll be very brief, and I'll pick up the question by Selene about how the UN can mediate the various actors, national actors especially, but also tie to the broader questions about reform and leadership. I'll start by asking a question: are we in the League of Nations moment? And for those who kind of are aware of the history, the League of Nations 1914, 1918, that happened in kind of following the First World War, but there was a 20-year crisis and then in the Second World War. Are we in that moment? I'll leave you with that question. But I'll ask, reflecting on the latest attempts to reform the UN, and that's in 2024 on the UN Summit for the Future, but also the Global Compact and the Pact for the Future. What lessons should be drawn from that, especially the outcomes, where some people argue it was kind of very inclusive, etc., but then it's completely lost traction because it's disconnected from the world we live in. One lesson I draw is, what is the cost of decentering states in these multilateral processes? Because some people say, of course, you should have other non-state actors, civil society, etc., but at what cost? And we saw in 2024, especially in that kind of global compact or the kind of Pact for the Future, other actors played a big role, especially in the US Secretary General's office, but then some states, especially in kind of decline and desire to some of these outcomes, argue that they were dissented from the process. And so that's a question about, what extent should intergovernmental processes kind of be centered in terms of these big reforms? That's one question. The second question as well, which also hasn't been asked, at least explicitly, is what is the future of liberal hegemony in the multilateral process? Because multilateralism, especially in the last 30 years, has been predicated on a liberal international order, which has liberal hegemony, that's also an aspect of Western leadership in it, but it's crumbling as people have noted. What ideas and actors should come, or rather shape what comes next? That's, I think, a question that I believe that is open, but then that's of course ties to the question that we raised about the next to the Secretary General. Can they avoid the League of Nations, or this being the League of Nations moment? I think that's a question for all of us. I don't know an answer, but I will know.
Well, thank you, Ken. I think you really wrapped it up very beautifully with those big questions. And I think there is a sense often in Europe that if Europeans are less powerful, that will mean a world with less international law and human rights. Other countries don't see it that way, not just because of Gaza, but not only because of Gaza. So there are questions about what a less Western international order might look like that we'll continue to explore in UNA discussions and hopefully future BISA events. Thank you very, very much to all of you for coming today, and enjoy the rest of your day.